The sun rose lazily on that pale Monday. The house seemed the same as always. The same smell of fresh coffee, the same clinking of cutlery, the same clock ticking indifferently. But there was something different about the warm, silent air. It was as if the air itself had forgotten to breathe. Beatriz moved slowly around the kitchen, her gestures precise and automatic, repeated for over 2 decades. The lace tablecloth on the table, the 2 cups side by side, the bread cut into perfect slices. Everything was as it always had been. But inside her, what had once been routine was beginning to feel empty. The absence of a look, a word, a simple touch screamed louder than the sound of the kettle boiling. At 50, Beatriz felt the weight of the accumulated days. Her face still held traces of delicacy, but there were shadows beneath her eyes, and a subtle sadness hidden behind automatic smiles. Her children had already gone their own ways, and her husband, Marcelo, was increasingly distant, as if they lived in parallel universes that only touched at the same dinner table. She watched him out of the corner of her eye, adjusting his tie in front of the living room mirror. His gestures were firm, predictable, cold. And yet, she tried to believe there was something there, a barely visible flame that might rekindle if the wind changed. But the morning wind didn't bring promises, it brought an end. When the door closed behind him, the silence that remained wasn't that of the house, but hers. A silence that echoed memories of old laughter, of unfulfilled dreams, of plans that never came to fruition. Beatriz sat at the table and looked at her still full cup. Steam rose slowly like a farewell. The day dragged on. The clock seemed to mock her slowness. The phone rang only for bank reminders. The world outside continued indifferently. And that evening, when Marcelo returned, there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before. It wasn't anger nor guilt. It was simply absence, an emptiness that spoke without words. Beatriz realized then that something was about to fall apart. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a fight. It was the end coming silently, like someone who had given up trying. When he left the room that night carrying a small suitcase, the air seemed lighter, and it frightened her. She didn't cry right away. She stood before the bed, the lamp on, staring at the empty space where a lifetime had once stood. Every memory seemed to fade, like ink running in the rain. The love she believed eternal revealed itself as nothing more than a story that reached its final chapter without warning. In the days that followed, time became a succession of similar mornings. The phone was silent. The house was too tidy. The mirror revealed wrinkles she'd never noticed before. Beatriz began to feel the weight of the silence as if it had a shape, and it was in this emptiness that something began to emerge. A small restlessness, a voice whispering that there was still something to be done. She began walking the neighborhood streets, observing the world as if seeing it for the first time. The people, the sounds, the colors, everything seemed distant, yet inviting. The feeling of being invisible began to mix with the curiosity of finding herself again. For the first time in a long time, she thought about herself. One afternoon, opening an old drawer, she found a notebook with a blue cover, stained by time. Inside were sketches of drawings she'd made in her early 20s before dropping out of design school to raise a family. The lines were simple, but they carried forgotten dreams. As she leafed through the pages, Beatriz felt a pang, not of pain, but of vivid, pulsating nostalgia. Her heart raced with the memory of who she had once been, the woman who dreamed of creating, of learning, of discovering herself, the woman whom time and responsibilities had buried under the weight of habit. And it was there, amid yellowed papers and dormant memories, that the decision began to form, timid but firm. In the following days, Beatriz began visiting university websites, observing courses and reading testimonials from people who had started over late. Each story she read ignited a spark within her. There was still fear, of course, the fear of ridicule, of loneliness, of failure. But there was also a new strength, as if time itself were telling her, "Now it's your turn." That night, sitting at the table where she had so often served dinner in silence, she opened her computer and filled out an application for an interior design course. Her hands were shaking, but her heart was calm. When she clicked confirm, she felt something different. It wasn't joy nor complete courage. It was simply the first step. The following days were filled with waiting and uncertainty. Sometimes she wondered if it wasn't madness, starting at 50, sitting among young people being watched, judged. But something inside her insisted. A soft, almost maternal voice, reminding her that there's no age limit for blossoming. When the confirmation email arrived, she simply smiled. A small, discreet smile, but genuine. The same smile of someone who, after a long winter, feels the first ray of sunlight touch their skin. Beatriz got up, opened the windows, and let the air in. The house seemed to breathe with her. The past was still there like a silent shadow, but it no longer dominated the space. The empty cup on the table still waited, as if it were an invitation to start the day, or life, over again. The improbable began there, in the simplest and most courageous gesture, that of trying again. Silence had become the new sound of the house. It was a heavy, thick silence that seeped into the walls and memories. In the first few days, Beatriz tried to fill it with noise, the radio on, the television repeating unimportant news, the kettle whistling on the stove. But no sound could disguise the absence. His voice, the jingle of his keys, the scent of his perfume after a shower. Everything had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of a time that would never return. Loneliness had a strange way of making itself felt. Sometimes it came disguised in small things. The empty plate on the table, the bed made only on one side, the remote control forgotten on the sofa. Other times it was an almost physical presence, a weight that followed her through the rooms. Beatriz began to notice details she'd previously ignored. The dust on the books, the old photos hanging on the wall, her own gaze reflected in the frames. It was as if the entire house were a mirror of what she had become, organized, silent, and dull. In the mornings, the bedroom mirror became her greatest challenge. She avoided looking at it. She hurried past it, looking away as if fleeing an uncomfortable truth. But at certain moments, the image would appear alone, without warning. The reflection showed a woman she barely recognized. The marks of time weren't just wrinkles, they were traces of renunciations, of identical days, of deferred dreams. There was a beauty there, discreet and tired, like a flower that had withstood the drought. But Beatriz couldn't see it. Not yet. The hours passed slowly, and time seemed to stretch like a rubber band about to snap. She tidied drawers, organized closets, cleaned every corner, as if she could reorganize her own life by clearing the empty spaces. Sometimes she would stop and observe the world through the window, the movement of people, the laughter of young people, the sunlight reflecting off cars. Everything went on, and this realization hurt more than any memory. The world didn't stop, and she felt stuck inside it. It was during one of these mornings that Beatriz noticed something new. The silence was beginning to have a sound. It was the sound of her own breathing, of the clock, of the wind rushing through the cracks. Little by little, she began to accept the emptiness not as punishment, but as space. A space where perhaps something new could fit. The sadness didn't disappear, but it changed form. It ceased to be despair and became a kind of serene melancholy, accompanying her steps with bitter sweetness. At night, sleep was difficult. She lay down and listened to her heart pounding, not out of passion, but out of awareness. The awareness that she was alone, truly alone, and that she needed to learn to live with it. Sometimes tears would flow for no apparent reason, and she let them flow. She discovered that crying wasn't a sign of weakness, but of liberation. It was her body telling her there was still life, even in pain. One afternoon, the sun streamed through the living room window and illuminated the piano, covered in a fine layer of dust. Beatriz ran her fingers over the keys, and the fragile sound of the note echoed through the room. It had been over 20 years since she had played. The sound, even tremulous, brought back a forgotten memory. The young woman who loved music, who dreamed of composing, who believed the world was a place open to discovery. For a brief moment, she felt alive again. It was as if time had opened a crack, allowing her to glimpse who she had once been. In the following days, Beatriz began to observe herself more closely. She began walking early in the morning, feeling the cold air touch her face. Sometimes she would stop in a square and simply observe the people. There was a mixture of weariness and curiosity in her eyes. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but there was a new restlessness, a thread of hope that insisted on not being broken. Life, silently, began to call her back. Memories of Marcelo still surfaced, but they no longer hurt as much as before. Now they seemed part of an ancient story, told in hushed tones. The love that had once existed had become something distant, almost abstract. Beatriz realized she had spent years trying to fit into a life that no longer belonged to her. Divorce, once seen as destruction, was beginning to reveal itself as liberation. It was during a sleepless night that she got up and walked to the mirror. The house was asleep and only the soft light from the lamp illuminated the room. For a moment she hesitated. Then she stared at her own reflection. The tired features, the lined eyes, the disheveled hair, everything there told a story. But there was also something new, something not there before: presence. For the first time, she saw herself. Not the abandoned woman, nor the forgotten wife, but the being who remained standing, breathing, existing. A whole being. The mirror stopped being an enemy. It became a silent ally, a witness to her reconstruction. Beatriz realized that aging wasn't the end of beauty, but the beginning of authenticity. There were lines on her face that spoke of courage, of surrender, of love. Each mark was a reminder of what she had lived. And in that moment, she felt a peace she hadn't known in a long time. Time, little by little, began to take on a different texture. The days were no longer so long, the mornings held subtle promises. Beatriz resumed her habit of drawing in small notebooks. They weren't masterpieces, but they were pieces of herself. Free, aimless strokes, like a breath of freedom. The pencil glided again, and with it came fond memories, forgotten dreams, simple sensations reborn beneath her fingertips. Little by little, fear began to give way to curiosity. One rainy afternoon, as she watched the raindrops run down the window, she wondered what it would be like to sit in a classroom again. The thought sent butterflies through her stomach and a faint smile. She didn't know if she would have the courage, but she enjoyed the feeling of imagining it. It was a timid desire, but it was a desire, and that was enough. The weeks passed, and the silence in the house transformed. It was still there, but now it was an inhabited silence. A silence that welcomed, that allowed one to breathe. Beatriz no longer needed to distract herself to escape it. She learned to live within it. She began to understand that emptiness is also a place, a space where the new can be born. And it was in this silence that she heard for the first time the sound of a new beginning. It didn't come from outside. It didn't come from the world. It came from within. It was the sound of the soul awakening after a long slumber. Beatriz didn't yet know what was to come, but something inside her had changed. The mirror, which had previously shown only lost time, now reflected possibilities. The face was the same, but the look in her eyes was different. The look of someone who, even though wounded, was beginning to blossom. The morning dawned with a different light, filtered by thin clouds that turned the sky a soft gray. Beatriz woke before her alarm. She spent a few minutes motionless, feeling her heart pounding, as if her body wanted to remind her she was alive. Anxiety came in waves, mixing fear and curiosity. It was the first day of a new phase, and she didn't know what awaited her. Her wardrobe seemed like a field of impossible choices. Her old clothes, marked by the routine of a life that no longer existed, seemed too heavy. After a few minutes, she chose something simple, neutral, and comfortable: a light blouse and lightweight pants. She applied lipstick with trembling hands, as if trying to paint courage on her face. Looking in the mirror, she found an expression she hadn't seen in a long time: determination. The ride to the university was silent. The streets were still awake, and people hurried on their way. Beatriz watched everything through the bus window, her reflection blending into the landscape outside. At times, she wondered what she was doing there. But something inside her told her that her fear was just the prelude to something greater. When she arrived, the enormous gate and the intense movement of young people made her hesitate. The sound of laughter, the hubbub, the coming and going of colorful backpacks, everything seemed to vibrate to a rhythm from which she felt excluded. She walked slowly through the courtyard, trying to blend in, but the difference was palpable. Curious glances and masked expressions of surprise followed her. She felt the weight of her own age like a burden visible to all. She entered the room and chose a discreet spot in the corner near the window. The room smelled of new books and youth. The whiteboard reflected the light coming through the blinds, creating delicate patterns on the tables. Beatriz took a deep breath, trying to control her heart. The sound of chairs scraping and voices talking formed a constant, almost deafening din. As she observed the faces around her, she realized how distant everything seemed. There was a world of animated expressions, cell phones in hands, hurried conversations. For a moment, she felt invisible, and at the same time, exposed. It was as if the simple act of being there challenged the logic of time. A 50-year-old woman sitting among 20-year-olds. An unlikely presence in a scene of beginnings. The class began, and she focused on the teacher's words. The content felt simultaneously familiar and new, as if it were awakening something that had always been dormant within her. Ideas flowed, and the feeling of learning again awakened a forgotten emotion. The pencil glided across the notebook, the notes forming lines and shapes that made sense. There was pleasure in the simple act of writing. During breaks, the sounds of laughter echoed through the hallways. Beatriz preferred to observe from a distance. She sat on a bench and watched the constant movement of people passing by, with backpacks and headphones, each carrying their own world. Sometimes a light breeze would ruffle her hair, and she would close her eyes for a moment, feeling the freshness. It was as if, for a few seconds, everything inside her went silent. The weeks passed, and a new rhythm began to settle in. Beatriz still faced the discomfort of stairs. Conversations interrupted when she approached, the feeling of not completely belonging. But little by little, the faces stopped being strange, and the days began to take on color. The initial fear faded, replaced by a calm born of persistence. During design classes, she immersed herself intensely. She spent hours drawing lines, experimenting with colors, recreating spaces. Each stroke was more than a learning experience, it was a form of reconnection. Design, which had previously been merely a broken dream, now became a bridge between what she had been and what she could be. Amidst this new world, a face appeared frequently, that of a younger student with a serene expression and attentive gaze. He seemed to notice her presence in a different way, without judgment. Sometimes he would pass by her and leave a discreet, almost imperceptible wave. Beatriz didn't know his name, but she sensed a lightness in his gaze, a quiet curiosity. It wasn't flirtation, it was recognition. Over time, group work brought the students closer together, and Beatriz began to be seen in a different light. Her maturity and attention to detail caught the attention of teachers and peers. In each exercise, she demonstrated patience and care, qualities many there had not yet learned to value. Gradually, the initial awkwardness gave way to respect, but the adjustment process wasn't easy. There were days when she returned home exhausted, doubting herself. The weight of responsibilities, the generational gap, the feeling of being a foreigner in a fast-paced world, all of it made her waver. Still, she kept going. There was a quiet strength within her, made of persistence and quiet faith. Small victories began to appear. A piece of praised work, a genuine smile from a colleague, the feeling of learning something new. Each achievement, no matter how small, was a reminder that she was still capable of growing. Time was no longer an enemy. It was a companion. On rainy days, Beatriz liked to stay in the library. The sound of drops hitting the windows mingled with the sound of pages turning. She felt at home in that silence filled with stories. The books, with their words and images, became silent friends. There, among shelves and ideas, she found shelter. One afternoon, while organizing materials for a project, The same kind-eyed student approached her to help her carry some folders. There was no exchange of words, just simple gestures, but the moment stayed with her. There was something comforting in the naturalness with which he treated her. No condescension, no surprise, just humanity. From that day on, Beatriz began to notice more details. The way he focused on tasks, the care with which he observed his surroundings, the slight smile when something pleased him. It wasn't fascination. It was mutual recognition. Two souls at different stages of life, united by the search for meaning. The semester progressed, and Beatriz, without realizing it, began to change. Her body seemed lighter, her gaze more alert. The mornings were no longer heavy. They held a sense of anticipation. The once empty routine now had purpose. The simple act of packing her bag with class materials became a ritual of rebirth. At the end of each day, when she returned home, she felt her exhaustion merge with a serene satisfaction. The past still existed, but it no longer defined the present. Life, quietly, began to reorganize itself, and amidst that new environment, among scribbled pages and unfinished drawings, something invisible blossomed. A subtle friendship, a connection yet unnamed, a bond born not of desire, but of the recognition of two souls who found each other at the right time, even if out of season. The improbable began to take shape, and Beatriz, without realizing it, was already walking not only toward a new future, but also within herself. Autumn arrived quietly, bringing with it a slight chill and a sense of change that seemed to permeate everything. The trees surrounding the university were tinged with gold and red, and the leaf-covered ground created a carpet that creaked beneath the students' hurried footsteps. For Beatriz, this scene of transformation reflected exactly what was happening inside her. It was a time of harvest and grief, of discovery and subtle loss. The relationship with Lucas, born so pure, began to elicit glances and whispers. At first it was just curious smiles, brief comments in the hallways. But soon it became insinuations, muffled laughter, and disguised gestures that left the air heavy. The prejudice, silent and disguised, began to spread like a shadow. Beatriz felt the weight of every look, the judgment hidden behind the kind words. The age difference, which had previously seemed insignificant, had now become an insurmountable social barrier in the eyes of others. She was seen as a woman out of place, a figure out of time. The affection that had made her flourish now placed her in a cruel display, and fear began to grow within her. The days that were once filled with enthusiasm and lightness became long and silent. The trips to university became painful. The sparkle in her eyes that had been with her since she met Lucas began to fade. She felt watched, invaded, as if her every gesture were interpreted through a distorted lens. The nights became sleepless again. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, trying to understand when the love that had set her free had become a prison. Her heart, once full, now shrank in fear of ridicule. Her mind, once open, now questioned what was right, what was acceptable. At some point, Beatriz began to distance herself. At first it was subtle, a colder greeting, an excuse to skip a group project, an absence disguised as fatigue. Then, the withdrawal became permanent. She stopped frequenting the same places, changed her schedule, and avoided any closeness that might rekindle the issue. Lucas's silence was respectful but firm. He didn't immediately seek her out, perhaps understanding there was something deeper going on than simple awkwardness. But the emptiness that had developed between them was palpable. His absence in the hallways was like a missing shadow, and paradoxically, the solitude she thought she was seeking became unbearable. College, which had once symbolized freedom, had now become an internal battlefield. Beatriz realized she wasn't fighting against others but against herself. The shame she felt came not from the gaze of others, but from what she carried inside, an ancient echo of everything she'd been told about what a woman should be. The following days dragged by at a slow, almost gray pace. The motivation that had driven her began to fade. Her notes lost their luster, her ideas felt empty. The new beginning, which had once been a cry for freedom, now became a hesitant whisper. She was fading, little by little, like a flame struggling to resist the wind. It was at this point of near give-up that something began to shift within her. One morning, walking alone through the university courtyard, Beatriz noticed something different in the reflection of the building's windows. The wind slowly made the leaves fall, and the image that formed seemed like a mirror of time itself. There, reflected in the glass, was a woman who had survived loss, abandonment, and fear, and yet was still standing. The relationship with Lucas, born so pure, began to elicit glances and whispers. At first it was just curious smiles, brief comments in the hallways. But soon it became insinuations, muffled laughter, and disguised gestures that left the air heavy. The prejudice, silent and disguised, began to spread like a shadow. Beatriz felt the weight of every look, the judgment hidden behind the kind words. The age difference, which had previously seemed insignificant, had now become an insurmountable social barrier in the eyes of others. She was seen as a woman out of place, a figure out of time. The affection that had made her flourish now placed her in a cruel display, and fear began to grow within her. The days that were once filled with enthusiasm and lightness became long and silent. The trips to university became painful. The sparkle in her eyes that had been with her since she met Lucas began to fade. She felt watched, invaded, as if her every gesture were interpreted through a distorted lens. The nights became sleepless again. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, trying to understand when the love that had set her free had become a prison. Her heart, once full, now shrank in fear of ridicule. Her mind, once open, now questioned what was right, what was acceptable. At some point, Beatriz began to distance herself. At first it was subtle, a colder greeting, an excuse to skip a group project, an absence disguised as fatigue. Then, the withdrawal became permanent. She stopped frequenting the same places, changed her schedule, and avoided any closeness that might rekindle the issue. Lucas's silence was respectful but firm. He didn't immediately seek her out, perhaps understanding there was something deeper going on than simple awkwardness. But the emptiness that had developed between them was palpable. His absence in the hallways was like a missing shadow, and paradoxically, the solitude she thought she was seeking became unbearable. College, which had once symbolized freedom, had now become an internal battlefield. Beatriz realized she wasn't fighting against others but against herself. The shame she felt came not from the gaze of others, but from what she carried inside, an ancient echo of everything she'd been told about what a woman should be. The following days dragged by at a slow, almost gray pace. The motivation that had driven her began to fade. Her notes lost their luster, her ideas felt empty. The new beginning, which had once been a cry for freedom, now became a hesitant whisper. She was fading, little by little, like a flame struggling to resist the wind. It was at this point of near give-up that something began to shift within her. One morning, walking alone through the university courtyard, Beatriz noticed something different in the reflection of the building's windows. The wind slowly made the leaves fall, and the image that formed seemed like a mirror of time itself. There, reflected in the glass, was a woman who had survived loss, abandonment, and fear, and yet was still standing. It was at that moment that she understood the true meaning of everything she was experiencing. Her love for Lucas wasn't the problem. It was the mirror. He had merely revealed how much she still feared allowing herself to be who she was. The external prejudice was merely an echo of the prejudice she still carried against herself, the fear of aging, of losing relevance, of being seen as someone past her prime. With this realization, a feeling of lightness began to emerge, shy but firm. She understood that the true enemy was never the judgment of others, but the belief that love and fulfillment had an expiration date. It was this belief that imprisoned her, not the looks or words of others. The following days were different. Silence was no longer a punishment, but a space to regroup. Little by little, Beatriz refocused on her studies, not as an escape, but as a reunion. Her final project, which had seemed distant, took on new meaning. Now every line she drew, every color choice, carried the power of what she had learned. The college still grumbled. But the rumors no longer hurt her. She had found something stronger than the approval of others: peace with herself. She understood that she didn't need to justify her feelings or prove anything to anyone. Love, when true, requires no explanation, only the courage to exist. At that point, something inside her matured completely. Looking in the mirror was different. There was no longer any shame, no need to hide who she was. The woman she saw there made no apologies for being intense, for desiring, for dreaming. She had discovered a new kind of freedom, the kind that comes when you no longer fear your own reflection. Autumn continued. The leaves continued to fall, and the world finally seemed to match Beatriz's inner rhythm. The cycle was closing. The struggle was no longer external, it was internal, and she had overcome it. In the quiet solitude of a random night, sitting at her desk with her notes and drafts, she felt a serenity she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't euphoria, nor sadness. It was acceptance. She realized she didn't need to fight time, because time was never an enemy. It was the space where transformation took place. Love, now, was not a storm, but a gentle reminder of how much she could feel, and that was enough. The cold wind blew in through the window, gently moving the pages of her notebook. She took a deep breath and smiled, a small but full smile. Life went on, and for the first time, she felt she could walk through it without fear. Beatriz had chosen not to run away anymore. The woman who once thought she was too old to start over now walked towards her future with firm, light and sure steps. And in the stillness of that night, something inside her was set free forever. Time had passed like a persistent breeze, not violent, but steady enough to wear away the old and make room for the new. The months of study had become a sequence of silent achievements, each a fragment of the woman Beatriz had become. What had once been fear was now serenity. What had once been doubt was now calm certainty. The final semester arrived with a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. The university, with its once intimidating hallways, was now an extension of her own home. The walls, the windows, the courtyard that had once suffocated her, everything seemed to welcome her steps. The professors who had once observed her curiously now admired her silently. She had become a reference, an inspiration, without ever having sought that role. The late nights of studying left subtle marks on her hands and eyes, but they were marks of construction, not fatigue. Beatriz understood that every effort, every tear shed in the silence of the night, had a greater purpose. When the final project was presented, the entire room seemed to breathe with her. Her work was not only beautiful, it was true. It told a story, hers, without needing words. The judging panel gave her a standing ovation, the sound echoing like the closing of a cycle that seemed impossible when it all began. There was pride in her eyes, but also humility. She knew that the diploma represented not only technical learning, but the courage to face herself. At the graduation ceremony, the auditorium was filled with colors, flowers, and smiles. The name Beatriz Alves was called respectfully, and the applause that followed seemed to come from a deeper place, not just from classmates and teachers, but from destiny itself, as if the universe recognized the value of her journey. The stage seemed distant yet intimate, and as she raised her diploma, a faint glow crossed her face. It was the light of a new beginning. The following days were silent yet full of meaning. The study routine gave way to a productive calm. Beatriz spent her mornings reviewing portfolios, submitting proposals, and setting goals. There was hope in every gesture, and a new serenity in every breath. She no longer waited for acceptance, now she knew she belonged wherever she was. When the invitation for a position at a design firm arrived, she read and reread the email with the same care one takes in observing the sunrise. The company's name was familiar, one she had visited during an academic fair. The offer was challenging and promising. She accepted without hesitation. Her first day at work brought back memories of the past, but also the certainty that she was no longer the same. The white office walls, the distant sound of keyboards, and the subtle scent of the atmosphere created a scene of a new beginning. The name tag hanging around her neck seemed a symbol of restored dignity. As she walked through the hallways, observing the design panels, the organized tables, and the flow of people, Beatriz felt a slight flutter in her stomach, not of fear, but of anticipation. It was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. And it was then, amid the hurried routine of her new job, that the unexpected happened. As she turned a corner, her eyes met a familiar face. Time hadn't dimmed the serene expression or the gentle gaze. Lucas, the student with the calm expression and quiet curiosity, was there, wearing a badge identical to hers, now a colleague. The encounter needed no words. A look was enough, mature, calm, full of recognition. There was no surprise, only the certainty that paths that were meant to cross always find a way to meet again. Time had changed them both. She, now a complete woman in her strength and serenity. He, a young man who carried the same calm as before, but with a different depth. The look they exchanged held respect, admiration, and a silent tenderness that dispensed with grand gestures. It wasn't a reunion of romantic destiny, but the closing of a cycle of souls that touched at the right moment. The following weeks were smooth sailing. Working together was natural and fluid. The exchange of ideas, the knowing glances over a project, the discreet smiles between meetings, everything happened at a serene pace, as if life wanted to show that true love doesn't have to be a storm. It can be a breeze. There was maturity in their relationship. It wasn't headlong passion, but a deep connection built on mutual admiration. Beatriz no longer saw herself through anyone else's eyes. She saw herself through herself. And in this serene self-view, love found space to exist without demands. Mornings at work brought new challenges, but also new certainties. She had discovered that time doesn't steal value. It only reveals its essence. Everything she had experienced, everything she had lost had served to refine what truly mattered. One late afternoon, as sunlight streamed through her office windows, Beatriz gazed out at the city. Shadows lengthened on the avenues, and the sky, tinged with gold, reflected off the glass buildings. In that image she saw herself, reflected, yet whole. The world remained the same, but she had changed. The mirror, that old silent enemy, was now just glass. Seeing herself reflected in it, there was no longer any criticism, no melancholy. There was peace. The lines of her face, the marks of time, everything told a story, and, for the first time, she found herself beautiful. At home, her desk had become a small shrine to her achievements. The framed diploma, the open books, the scribbled notes. Each object bore witness to the journey that had brought her there. At night, she liked to light a candle and let the light flicker over the pages. It was a simple, almost ritualistic gesture, as if silently thanking herself for having the courage to not give up. The days became lighter. Beatriz woke with a desire to live, with a clear mind and a peaceful heart. The past was no longer a wound, but a root. The future, an open field. And when I passed Lucas in the hallways, there was always that same calm gaze, that same silent understanding, the kind of connection that doesn't need promises. Love now wasn't need, but consequence. She finally understood that starting over isn't about erasing what we were, but integrating what we've learned. That the improbable happens not to prove something to others, but to ourselves. The city remained alive outside with its rhythm, its lights, its sounds. But inside Beatriz, time flowed at a different frequency, that of serenity. As she walked home in the twilight, she lifted her face to the wind. The pink and gold sky seemed to smile. Each step was an affirmation. She had won. There was no audience, no witnesses, just the silent certainty of someone who had completely rebuilt themselves. And deep in my soul, a message remained, clear as the brightness of the sun setting on the horizon. It's never too late to start over. The improbable only happens to those who have the courage to try.